Let's get straight into it. Representatives of about 30 organizations are gathering in Johannesburg in what they call a workers' parliament. They want the new draft code of good practice on dismissal to be scrapped. They say the code is pro-employer and that unions as well as labor organizations were excluded from talks on the policy guidelines. For more on this, we're joined in by Katleho Sekhotho, who joins us now. Katleho, let's just give us a clear understanding what this policy framework is about exactly and what today's talks are certainly about.
Good morning, Arabile. Indeed, it's the draft code of good practice on dismissal, and it relates to the policy, if you will, that employees and employers should abide by, guidelines in the termination of employment if someone works at a company, and the processes that should be followed. Now, it is, under the Department of Employment and Labor, under the Labor Relations Act of 2003. And now this new draft code seems to, aims to present new guidelines in terms of what the procedures should be that employers and employees should follow. So it's not an act or a bill in the legislative perspective that, would need to be passed in Parliament, but it does give guidance in terms of how workplaces should end a contract or terminate employment of an employee and what that process should look like. So it's not binding from a legal perspective in terms of a law or a bill, but it does have weight when it comes to if one has to dispute a dismissal when it's taken to the CCMA, then there's legal grounds in which were there good practice, were the employment or the termination of that contract, were the steps procedurally followed in that sense, and making sure that there is a fair process that is followed when the contract or the employment of someone is terminated. But to get more details, I have with me Kiwusa President, Mr. Sibe, to give us more details. Thank you so much for your time. Take us through what the talks will look like today and what you're actually calling for as the various organizations.
Well, this is an assembly of various working class movements that, constitute what you call, the parliament of the workers to reflect on the onslaught that the working class is facing at the present moment. So it will be SAFTU and its affiliates, unions like USA, and many others. It will be independent unions. It will be other organizations, as well as community civics and other movements of the working class who want to join with us on the questions of the attacks on the rights of the workers, particularly the newly published draft code of good practice, but also will be expanding on other issues concerning the working class at this point in time. Austerity from government, as reflected in this budget, including the VAT increase, but also the acceleration of the privatization of Eskom, of Transnet, of Post Office, and many other public services that is part of the program of this government of national unity.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Sibe, on paper, it looks like this new draft code will work. Why are you challenging it and saying this doesn't quite sit well with us as organizations and for our workers?
The draft code takes us back to the 70s and the 80s. We've got to be absolutely clear to the tyranny of an apartheid workplace, where basically a foreman could simplify a worker at will. I mean, back then the saying used to be that it took someone a lot of optimism to even be carrying a lunch box, because you wouldn't know whether it's still behaving a work at lunch. Mm-hmm. And what does it provide for? One is that it basically means you can now dismiss, or you're going to be able to dismiss a worker without a disciplinary inquiry, which is a mandatory in the in the current legislative framework. Right. You have got to take a worker to hearing. That hearing must be procedurally fair, but also it should allow for ventilation of issues, including proper representation, to make sure that the worker is also dismissed on substantially or fair grounds and so on. Right? They want to dispense with that, but also in terms of incapacity, they want to expand the scope. At the present moment, You can't be, working for your employer. You get injured at work, and then the employer simply toss you away like they do a machine that no longer works, right? When you are incapacitated, particularly due to injury at work, the general expectation that the employer continues, of course, to accommodate you since you lost your capacity in his employment and so on. They also want to limit, particularly, the entitlement to every form of a process, any form of process on the part of the workers in probation, right? So now when you're in probation, even when the employer is of the view that, you are not performing, there still has got to be a process, including what can be done to improve you, what sort of support do you need, things like that. They want to dispense with that. In fact, their provision on the process is that the disciplinary hearing can be, substituted by what they call a conversation, a dialogue. In the case of probation workers, they're not even entitled in that so-called dialogue and conversation to a union representation. And just imagine, right, a newly employed worker, new at workplace, right, not knowing anything about his or her rights, the process, but also the power relation and dynamic between them and the management, just being fired in a process that does not involve an entitlement to a union representation. That sounds more like a kangaroo court and a process that would be substituting the rights that workers currently are having.
And I guess just the last one, Mr. Sibe, when one looks at this new draft, it considers the resources that small businesses may lack in terms of, how big businesses may go through those procedures and small businesses might not be able to. When you consider what the draft code is proposing as it relates to small establishments, your response in that sense?
It is a problem. Even the fact that they want to say that the process for retrenchment, which already allows employers so much powers over workers, whenever there's restructuring in terms of retrenchment and layoffs of workers and so on, right? They want to dispense with the requirements and the protections of the workers in that process. And the problem here is what? There is a small business, right? What does it even mean in terms of resources? Because what the current law says is that there must be adequate consultation. So even when you are running a small business, you and your manager, you sit down with the workers, whether they're represented by the union or not, who are going to be affected by the retrenchment, and to be able to say to them, this is the current state of the company, this is the option that we are facing, and jointly you actually explore, what alternatives are there to saving jobs and so on, right? How can that be unaffordable, right? And what people need to understand is that you are talking about decisions here that will have a lifelong impact, particularly in a country where being retrenched means you're going to join over 12 million long queue of the unemployed, and in many cases, you are likely not to find ever any alternative employment. Surely, saying a manager or owner of a small establishment must sit down with the worker and to be able to ventilate issues, to make sure that they jointly explore what alternatives are there. All of that, I can't see how it will kill small businesses. What we are seeing here is a generalized onslaught that is linked with attacks of the working class on the organized labor movement and the working class power in general, in order to show up profitability of business in the context of the organic crisis of South African capitalism and world capitalism at large.
We'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, Arabile, there you've heard it from the Kiwusa president, Mr. Sibe, just outlining there the kind of talks that will be happening here, certainly standing very firmly against this new draft code of good practice on dismissal, outlining their issues around the lack of consultative process as it relates to, a disciplinary hearing, going through the proper process in engagement between manager and employer before before an employee is dismissed, and certainly they'll be ventilating, the various organizations, they'll be ventilating their concerns around that and challenging this new draft code.